Servus Männer, it's Red Pill Germany again. Today I want to talk about debt from a German perspective. I hope I can show you in this video how debt is used as an instrument to control people and groups of people. Of course, the lending of money for interest allows people to have effortless, laborless income. I want to start with what debt means for a single individual or for a private household, and then, of course, in the end, move the discussion to debt of nations and corporations. And I hope that I don't become too metaphysical towards the end. So when Germans are talking about economics, or if you want to understand the German perspective on economics, I think everybody has to understand two things. And the first thing most people know, I think, and that is that Germans are afraid of inflation. Because in the 20th century, we had two very bad cases of inflation. And I think everyone knows that cliche that people had to go to the baker and buy a loaf of bread with lots of bills in a wheelbarrow. This is why we like a stable currency and are very skeptical of quantitative easing and things like that. We want our currency, our money, to keep its value. And 20th century, that is a rather recent thing, but nevertheless, the fear of inflation became part of our mentality. There is a second aspect you need to understand, and that one is much older. It is so old that it is even reflected in our ancient language. The German words for guilt and for debt is one and the same word, Schuld. And one can really try to wrap one's head around what that actually means. For many people, debt in an economic sense is just a necessity. If you want to buy a house or if you want to buy stuff or start a business, debt is very normal. And I think in the current economic clown world environment where interest rates are low and people are even debating negative interests for savings now, you actually are the smart guy if you are borrowing money. And saving money in a conventional sense, maybe without risky stocks or something like that, bears huge opportunity costs right now. Because zero interest and inflation makes your money melt like snow in the sunshine. And don't even get me started on the bond market. So when we consider the fact that guilt and debt is one and the same word in German, it doesn't really surprise us that if you are in debt, it is seen by most Germans as a moral shortcoming, almost as if you committed a sin when you are in debt. The exception might be buying a family home or starting a business. However, in these cases, you didn't just consume the money, you bought something of value for it, which you can sell again and pay the money back. So it is not really gone. Going into debt for your education is not really something that Germans think a lot about because our education system, our higher education system also at university, is tax funded. Now, if you are a person who just has some costly vices or who lives beyond his means and you end up owing money to people as a result, now that is actually seen as a really big deal for Germans and they really see it as something like a sin, even though they might not be religious anymore. Now, all of these things I mentioned might be true traditionally for Germans, but Germany is already transforming rapidly, and we say then that things and people here in Germany become Americanized. It is actually fairly obvious that there are powerful voices in our society now that want to seduce you, that want to tempt you to go into debt. Nowadays, there is much more advertising everywhere, and of course, you need to have the bigger house, you need to have that car, and you always need to look fashionable. People who are mentally rather weak often go into debt for these frivolous things. And there is one thing that has always been the case, I think, in Germany, and that is that employers want their employees to be married most of the time. It is maybe not as extreme as in Japan yet, where the manager would actually hook you up with a girl and demand you to just get married now. But bosses and managers still ask their employees if they are married or when they will get married. Of course, they couldn't say so officially, but promotions normally go to people that are married. And I think the reasoning behind that is fairly obvious. If you want to start a family, you normally need a big house, because the woman just demands that. That means that the average person who didn't inherit a mountain of gold will have to pay back the loan that he took on buying or building that house during the course of his whole professional life in many cases. That means you don't want to move away, you're tied to the place, and you have a lot of money to pay back. That means you just cannot afford to lose that job. If you lose that job, you lose the house, you lose the marriage and the children. Now just imagine that management asks you for unpaid overtime all of a sudden, or working on the weekend without pay, of course. You will find yourself in a rather weak bargaining situation when everybody in the company knows that you cannot afford to lose that job. So getting a huge loan and consequently falling into debt makes you the perfect victim, the perfect target for corporate sharks. And it severely limits and reduces your personal freedom and liberty. Now, this is a quite common example from the workplace, and I think it already tells us something very general. Debt reduces your freedom. It's not just that you have to pay money back at some point. No, the choices you make and your everyday life will become altered quite severely when your environment knows and you know that you are in debt. So I really want you to think critically about your own life and what changes in your life when you are owing money to someone versus the case where you are absolutely debt-free. And this very general principle, this very general truth doesn't only apply to private citizens and private households. No, it applies in a national and international context just as well. What about corporations? Let's look at that next. If you compare a corporation that has debt with one that doesn't, it is easy to see that the interest payments that the indebted company has to pay every month will make them ask a higher price for a similar product, or it will just leave them less money to invest and to do research, for example. That means if the industry is heavily in debt, the prices for the consumers are rising or innovation is stifled. And now when the state is going into debt, it becomes even worse. Of course, politicians want a lot of money so that they can buy votes and fulfill all the wishes of the good people of their nation, among other purposes that they need money for, of course. And it just seems to be in the nature of politicians and the state in general that they always spend a little more than they have every year. Of course, a corporation will just go bankrupt, but a state can increase the taxes. A state can take the money directly from the citizens. In the present, you will almost not find a nation anymore that isn't in debt, and so governments become ever more creative to find new sources of income. And so when you look at prices in an economy, you will see that the debt of the state and the interest payments that go along with that will add a component, will add a weight to every price of every good and every service in that economy. Because the corporations and the consumers will have to pay that interest, and the state is just taking it in the form of taxes. And there is really nothing that the people can do other than a revolution, which is of course a last resort and an act of desperation. And isn't that convenient for the people who lend that money to us and our governments? Now, what would then be the morally right thing to do from a German's perspective? It would be, of course, that also states don't live beyond their means and spend money that they don't have, even when the temptation is so high to stimulate the economy a little more, because future generations will have to pay it back with interest. And I really like the story in the Bible in the Old Testament of Joseph, who was sold by his brothers and ended up as a servant in Egypt. He rose eventually to become the Pharaoh's advisor, as he had the ability to interpret people's dreams. Now, you might have heard of that story. The Pharaoh was dreaming about 7 fat cows followed by 7 skinny cows. Joseph interpreted that as 7 fat and wealthy years followed by 7 years of hardship due to a bad harvest. He then advised the people of Egypt to build granaries and store the food in there. And that is, of course, what nations should do. In times of an economic boom, you should build up reserves in foreign currency, for example, or invest in infrastructure. Also, paying back your debts is a good idea so that you have money to spend and you don't need to borrow new money when the economic downturn comes. The problem is just that this never really seems to work because nations never really have the discipline required to actually save in good times or to invest wisely in order to secure future welfare of their people. There are just too many temptations. And when I see now that Christine Lagarde will probably, very certainly, become the next head of the European Central Bank, and when I look at what she said in the past and how she has positioned herself when it comes to quantitative easing and modern monetary policy and all these things, the outlook for Europe becomes quite bleak, in my mind at least. Just the other day I read an article how the US government asks Germany to send troops to the Middle East. They still haven't had enough of nation building and looking for WMDs and smoking guns in the sand. It is the same kinds of people tried to tell us that the Vietnamese were the aggressors in the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The same types of people who coached a certain lady who claimed that she was a nurse in a Kuwaiti hospital, and those evil invading soldiers took the babies right out of the incubators. Of course, it turned out that this young lady was in fact the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. And they don't even try to hide who is behind that. Look at those people. Who are they involved with? International Women's Forum, Council on Foreign Relations. And don't forget our greatest ally in the region, who of course knew that the Bush administration was wrong to assume that there are WMDs in Iraq. Did they say something? No, they didn't want to ruin the great narrative that the Bush administration had come up with. Why am I bringing up these things? Well, easy. Nothing makes a country borrow money more readily and more easily and in larger quantities than military misadventures and the sense of being threatened. Military spending and military conflicts will create huge amounts of debt in record time. And that, of course, gives immediately some business to people who sell weapons, but in the long run, it will give passive income, continued income to the people who finance a war effort. Sometimes they even finance both sides at the same time. Now imagine I live in a house and my neighbor has a farm. And then one day a gang of bandits comes to a forest near his farm. He doesn't feel safe anymore as those bandits start harassing his family and stealing some of his animals. Of course, I help my neighbor and I lend him some money so that he can hire guards to make his farm safe and save his family business. Of course, I earned the interest that I get in return in the following 20 or 30 years. And sure, his farm is a little less profitable and for a certain fraction of the time he actually has to work for me, but without me, he couldn't have continued at all. So I am of course a noble person and everyone would agree that I did a good thing. How does it look, however, when it turned out that I didn't just help him with the money, I actually hired the gang of thugs that harassed his family. So I created the demand for protection in the first place. I don't think many people will call that noble behavior. But this is what happened in world history time and time again. And then there are countries that are just tired of fighting and they don't want to go to war anymore. Look at Sweden, look at Germany. You have populations there that are so peaceful and bovine, the idea to attack another country would not come to mind. And if anybody suggested that, he would be ostracized from the group and actually fought by a broad coalition of all social classes and groups. But the people who want to live from the interest payments of the working nations of the earth, have more than just weapons and war in their arsenal. To those nations that are tired of fighting, they have another product line to offer. They sell them things like saving the climate or ending hunger on the planet. Yeah, they actually make them open their borders and just take in a couple of million of Africans. Also, they will make them switch off their modern nuclear power plants and create electricity with medieval windmill technology, which is of course a fluctuating stochastic source of electricity and cannot even be used in an industrialized country. Of course, all these crazy things cost trillions of euros, and the nation goes further and further into debt even in a time of economic boom. And the older I get, I have to tell you, I more and more am convinced that it doesn't even matter to them what they sell us or what kind of ideas they put into our heads for which we should go into debt. It doesn't matter to them if it is a war or if it is climate change or if it is migration. The only thing that matters in the end is that we spend more than we actually have, that we constantly live beyond our means so that future generations have to pay for it. And a world without debt would be a world without interest. And without interest payments, everyone would have to work. And for those people, that is actually a life-threatening idea. They would fight this scenario with all their might, and by any means necessary, they will want to fight the idea of austerity and living within your means and not going into further debt. That can mean that they will show themselves to be warmongers and call people who don't want interventionist military misadventure anymore all sorts of names. Or they will tell you that you are personally responsible for everything that goes wrong in the world, and every human suffering in the world on the entire planet can be traced back to you. Yes, to you. They will attack us on all fronts. As I said in the beginning, they want private households, corporations, and states to be constantly in ever-growing debt. That is the world in which they can live quite comfortably. And people are really wondering why we have to work harder and can afford less. Just compare the life of a millennial or a zoomer with that of a boomer. What can they afford at a certain age? What kind of buying power does an hour of their labor have today? Sure, we have computers and nice technology, but there has always been technological progress, and we surely don't owe our technological progress to the boomers. Yes, the eternal boomer. So I really started to think of news I read or current events, considering the following question. Does it get us out of debt or further into debt? And it doesn't have to be debt right now, and it doesn't have to be interest payments right now. For example, the interest payments as part of the German federal budget have been continuously declining year by year recently. However, we just accepted a large group of, how should I say that, future liabilities. We already see that in the budget right now, of course, but we don't really see the immense liabilities that they bring with them in the future. They will not go away, and they will keep eating and demanding even if our economy will go into recession. And that is what I meant, this anti-cyclical idea of saving or investing in the fat years so that you have something or need less in the meager years. Yeah, it sounds good in theory, but it never works because we don't have the discipline, or we think that we are so strong and so powerful and so rich that we can just afford it. But that is a giant misconception, one that will be very costly and dangerous in the future. So I think the ancient Germans were very, very wise. They already saw that debt is the same thing as guilt. It is morally unjust and reprehensible behavior because it leads to reduced freedom and liberty and to parasitic business models. So maybe when you read the news tomorrow or next time you hear a story from the realm of international politics or economics, ask yourself, does it bring us out of debt or further into debt? then you should look who is promoting these ideas and who is actually behind it. At least for me, this mental exercise was incredibly mind-opening and revealing. It's these things that everybody kind of knows them, but I'm the kind of guy, I have to actually spell it out for myself. And maybe I do that in many videos, that I actually spell out things for people that are kind of known, but for me actually it helps when I spell it out and I really become aware of the actual issue. So of course the globalist elites, the owner class of the planet so to speak, has no interest in us or our governments ever getting out of debt. This is one reason why I found the movie The Matrix so powerful. When I just saw these human bodies in these capsules and being basically batteries, of course as a scientist I have to add that the idea that a human body would act as something like a battery is preposterous. It would be the worst generator / battery in the universe, but just the image I thought was so strong, that there is a force in the universe that is basically turning people into livestock, into farm animals basically. And I guess this is what we pretty much are. We might not be kept on the plantation by armed guards with whips and rifles, but by sweet, seductive advertisement slogans and by public institutions that tell us to get married and go to college, and by politicians and NGOs who tell us to go to war, or to save the climate, or to save Africans. In the end, to them it's all the same. It's just another flavor of ice cream, and the purpose in the end is always the same: to keep you in bondage, to keep you on the plantation. And even if an individual doesn't have any debt, like me for example, it doesn't help when you live in a country that is hopelessly in debt and whose government just has the power to take whatever it wants from the citizens. So if mankind truly wants to be free, maybe instead of a new world order, we should go back to the wisdom of the ancient Germans, who knew that debt is guilt and a sin. Stay safe wherever you are. Servus, Kameraden.
Yay! Juju come!